Chapter 12. The Collector of Lost Things. The laughing girl and the blue dragon came back one day, about a week after the trial ended, with a child. She was perhaps 5 years old, with hair the colour of winter straw and eyes that were milky white and clearly unseeing. She walked with the careful step of someone who had learned to navigate a world she could not see with her eyes, one hand resting lightly on Yenna's arm as she guided her down from Rishan's back and into the house. Rishan folded himself back to a man and followed, face alight with the joy of someone who has found something precious and cannot wait to share it. "We found her in a village 3 days north," she said as the child stood quietly beside Rishan, her head tilted as if listening to something the rest of them could not hear. "She was being kept in a barn on a tether. They said she was cursed, that her eyes proved she had been touched by evil." The child turned her head toward Elisa with uncanny precision and said, in a voice as clear as spring water, "Green." Elisa blinked. The child turned toward Raina. "Gold." Then toward Rishan. "Blue." She smiled, small and certain. "You are all dragons." Elisa crossed the room in 3 strides, knelt, and looked at the child with the intensity dragons reserve for things that surprise them. "How do you know?" "I can see you," the child said simply. "Not like people see. But I can see what you are. The shape of your magic. The colour of your wings when you are not wearing your other skin." Elisa picked her up, and the child settled against her hip as if she had always belonged there. "What is your name?" Elisa asked. "They called me No Eyes," the child said, "but I do not like that name." "Then we will find you a better one," Elisa said, smiling. "The little one is to come with me, as was foretold." Raina looked at her mother sharply. "The oracle." "Years ago, when she brought your prophecies," Elisa confirmed, "she said that one day a child would come to me who could see dragons but not light, that the child would need to be raised for her, and that I would be the one to do it." She looked down at the girl in her arms. "Welcome home." The blue dragon kept coming with more children. The second arrived 2 weeks later, a boy of perhaps 7, dirty and scared, with bruises on his arms and fear in his eyes. Rishan set him down gently in the courtyard at Redder House and looked at Yenna with such sadness that she could not refuse. "We will keep him," she said, and the boy, who had been braced for rejection, burst into tears. The third came 2 days after that, a girl no older than 3, found wandering a roadside, too young to remember where she had come from, and nobody within walking distance spoke up to know her either. By the time the fourth arrived, Yenna was exasperated. "Rishan," she said, standing in the courtyard with 2 children clinging to her skirts and one asleep on her shoulder. "We do not even have a home. Where are we supposed to raise all these children?" Rishan looked at her with the misery of someone who knows they are being unreasonable but cannot help themselves. "I cannot leave them," he said quietly. "They have no one. And he stopped, his hands curling into fists. "I know what it is to be discarded, to be called worthless. I cannot walk away." Yenna's frustration melted into something softer. "I know," she said. "I am not asking you to. I am asking you to help me figure out how we are going to manage this." It was Lord Redder who offered the solution. He had been listening from his chair by the window, as he often did these days, letting the sounds of the house wash over him like a tide. He looked at the children clinging to Yenna, to the little girl holding Rishan's hand, and smiled. Then he simply said, "The house will be empty soon. I will leave it to you." Yenna blinked. "Lord Redder, we could not." "You can," Redder said, his voice quiet but firm. "Lady Lyanna and I have already discussed what comes next. After I am gone, she will go to High Pass with Alaris. This house will need a purpose. Let it be this." He looked at Rishan, who stood with the stillness of someone who has been offered something they do not believe they deserve. The North needs an orphanage, Reda continued, a place where children who have been discarded can learn that they are not worthless, that they can be loved. You have already started the work. Finish it here. Yenna's throat tightened. And King Antias? Would he? Auntie, Reda said, smiling faintly, could use having you around to keep him honest. And the children will do him good. Remind him what he is working for. Rishan dropped to his knees, his head bowed. My lord, I... Stand up, Reda said, not unkindly. You are not a servant here. You are family. And family does not kneel. Rishan stood, his eyes bright, and for the first time since Yenna had known him, he smiled without grief behind it. The blue dragon loved being among children. He brought them home with a frequency that would have been alarming if it were not so clearly driven by love. Orphans and abandoned ones, children who had been left by the roadside or locked in barns or told they were cursed. He found them and he brought them to Reda House, and Yenna welcomed them all. Within a year, Reda House had become the North's unofficial orphanage. Within 2, it was official. Sometimes Rishan came home with children not yet born, still within the women who bore them with desperation in their eyes, snatched from riverbanks and mountain ledges, contemplating the kind of bargains the Blue had seen go so horribly wrong once. He helped them down, not up now, and Yenna understood. They stayed and worked at the house until they were ready to go. Sometimes, rarely, a young man would come, cap in his hands, to claim what he had let foolishly be driven away. More often they went with their child to start a new life on their own. Rarely a girl would refuse to even look at the babe and walk away alone. And that too was considered a kindness, to give the child she never consented to having a chance to find someone who wanted them desperately. And as the house became known, those who sought a child to raise came too, never trusted blindly, but more often than not, leaving with what they sought if the seeking was honest. The children called Rishan Papa Blue because he was the one who found them and brought them home. They called Yenna Mother because she was the one who fed them and held them and taught them that they were worth keeping. And they thrived. Lord Reda did not live to see the coronation. He passed on a quiet August evening without making a fuss about it, surrounded by the family he had chosen when blood had failed to give him one. Alaris was there, holding his hand. Elisa sat beside him, her presence a comfort even in silence. Raina stood nearby. Marius and Riff had brought Sienna, who sat on the floor beside his chair and told him about the wind. Lady Liana sat on his other side, her hand in his, and when his breathing finally stopped, she did not cry. She simply kissed his forehead and said, "Wait for me." They buried him in the estate's cemetery with reverence, a simple stone, his name, and the dates that marked a life well lived. For a man unable to have children of his own, the family-only event was quite crowded. Alaris stood at the graveside and spoke of a father who had taught him honour without cruelty, strength without arrogance, and love without condition. Marius spoke of a grandfather who had shown him that fairness was not weakness. Raina spoke of a man who had taught her that being fierce and being kind were not opposites. Raifa said only, "He made me a knight. I will carry that with honour." And Yenna, who had known him only briefly, said, "He gave us a home. We will fill it with the children he would have loved." Lady Liana, weeping but smiling, assured them all, for a man unable to have children, this is exactly the family he would have wanted. Crowded, loud, and full of people who chose to be here. They stood together in the cemetery as the sun set, and when the last words were spoken, they walked back to the house that was no longer his, but would always carry his name. Reda House, which had been built to hold one family, would now hold one larger than it ever expected to hold. And Lord Reda, who had spent his life teaching children to be better than the world expected, would have been pleased. Epilogue. The Little Lights. The formal coronation was grand in the way northern ceremonies are, less gold and theatre than the southern courts preferred, but weighted with history, and the kind of solemnity that comes from knowing crowns are earned, not inherited by accident of birth. The great hall had been filled to capacity. Nobles from all 4 kingdoms stood in their delegated sections, wearing their finest and trying very hard not to step on ancient rivalries that had been temporarily set aside for the sake of diplomacy. Solara stood near the front, radiant in silk that had been chosen for her by people who understood that former wet nurses who had become queens needed to look the part. Beside her stood King of the East, Rife's father holding the hand of a boy, about 6 with a cheap-looking locket on a string on his chest, to whom Sienna waved frantically and called Little Uncle, to Caspian's puzzlement. Marius and Rife stood near the dais, proud and content in the knowledge that they had done their part and could now return to their own kingdom, their own weather tower, their own carefully balanced ledgers. Sienna stood next to them, trying very hard to look dignified, and only occasionally succeeding, other hand firmly in Caspian's palm. Even the sly King of the West had come, standing with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned that giving offence at another king's coronation was bad for trade. He wore his crown with the ease of long practice and his smile with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much charm was required and refused to spend more. Next to him stood a boy about the same age or a bit younger as Sienna's little uncle, his own son, quiet and observant. The Western king eyed the other children curiously, filing the detail away for future consideration. Eliza and Alaris stood to the side, not as dignitaries, but as family. Lady Lyanna sat beside them, her hand resting lightly on Alaris's arm, looking small and proud and satisfied in the way women do when they have lived long enough to see the children they raised do well. The seer child, Mira, sat on Eliza's hip, her milky white eyes turned toward the throne, as if she could see something the rest of them could not. "Mama Green," she whispered to Eliza, her head turning to look at the room, "the new king has no colour, just duty. Yet the room is full of small lights. There is a lot of storm and ground, and a bit of water and fire too. The fire is not awake, but wind has blown on it, and it will awaken soon. And the water is so very scared and hiding itself." Eliza smiled and stroked the child's hair. "I wish I could see what you see, little one." And in the back, standing taller than he had in years, Rishan watched with Yenna at his side. Around them clustered a small army of children, some old enough to understand what was happening, some too young to care, all of them clean and fed and wearing clothes that fit properly because Yenna had insisted. The ceremony proceeded with the formal weight of tradition. Auntie knelt. The crown was placed, the sword was given, the oaths were spoken, promises to rule justly, to protect the weak, to keep the roads clear and the arguments civil. He stood as King Antias of the North, and the hall erupted in applause. He put another crown on his wife with a whispered apology, and Lady Yvonne took it with a graceful bowing of her head, and straightening thereafter, with the resolve to shoulder this duty alongside her man. When the ceremony was done and the formalities observed, it was time for the guests to depart to their homes. Marius clasped Auntie's arm with the grip of men who have become brothers through shared trials and mutual exasperation. "You will do well," he said. "I will try not to start a war in the first year," Auntie replied dryly. "That," Marius said grinning, "is all I ask." Rif embraced Yvonne, who held her newborn daughter with the careful exhaustion of new mothers everywhere. "Send a word if you need anything," Reifer said, "or if he becomes insufferable." "I will," Yvonne promised, smiling. Raina hugged Yenna, who had chosen the sky and found in that choice a purpose she had never expected. "The blue suits you," Raina said. "He does," Yenna agreed, glancing at Rishan, who was currently surrounded by children explaining to him, in great detail, why the coronation had been too long. He looked truly happy. "Come visit," Yenna added. "The house is loud, but there is always room." "I will," Raina promised. Elisa carried Mira as she went to the king. "Congratulations, Your Majesty," she said with only the faintest hint of teasing. "Thank you," Auntie said, and then, more quietly, "Marius will pay for this." She smiled. "Make the payment fit the crime. There are worse crimes than making a dutiful good man a king. Letting it fall into the hands of the wrong one is one of them." One by one, they said their farewells and began the long journeys back to their homes. The southern coach rolled away with Marius, Riff, and Sienna inside, heading back to a kingdom where the weather tower waited and grain needed counting. The eastern dragons took to the skies, Raina in her gold scales, carrying the few belongings she had brought and eager to return with Severin's black, trailing behind her, to the forest house with its newly finished roof, but only after seeing the coach with Solara's family safely to the eastern court. Eliza and Alaris returned to High Pass, taking Lady Lyanna and little Mira with them. Lyanna would live out her remaining days in the nest she had helped build, surrounded by mountains and the comfort of knowing she had done her work well. And Mira would learn what her own destiny would be. The Western King departed with his entourage, taking along his spy and a warning from the new king. The promise to not start a war in the first year was hovering over thin ice, but for now, the ice propped by a promise held. And at Reader House, Rishan stood tall, no longer hunched, no longer wearing the leather collar that had once marked him as a worthless thing merely kept, and helped Yenna herd their ever-growing collection of children through the doors and into the home that had been given to them by a man who had understood that family was built, not born. The blue dragon had found his purpose, not in glory or power, but in service to the weakest, the forgotten, the ones the world had decided were not worth keeping. He served them with joy. In the palace, King Antias of the North sighed and settled into the throne that he had been shoved on without asking for his consent. He carried the weight of the crown with the resigned determination of a man fulfilling a duty he had never wanted, but was learning to find useful. The kingdom needed roads. It needed fair taxes. It needed someone who would listen to merchants and commons alike, and not mistake the noise of politics for the work of ruling. He could do that. He would do that. But as he sat in the council chamber later that evening, reviewing ledgers and listening to advisers argue about grain tariffs, he found himself plotting for the day to make that pretty dragon's mate pay for dropping the crown on him, not with real venom, but with the vengefulness of a brother planning a prank. She had chosen the sky. He had been stuck with the crown. And someday, when the opportunity presented itself, he would make sure she remembered that friendship came with consequences. Same applied to Marius, who had made good on the playful threat he had issued at the start of the trial. He smiled to himself, made a note in the margin of the ledger, and got back to work. The North had a king made out of duty, a knight to the crown that had landed on his own head. The South had its weather mage with a battle-hardened queen by his side. The East had its king whom no magic could touch, and a queen who had walked through every station in life before becoming a queen. The West had its sly fox of a ruler who was still not content with what he had. Next to each stood a child holding the beginnings of their own journey to their own destinies and choices to come. Crowns and magic, duty and love braiding into new stories. The story, as all good stories do, continued.